So I wanted to start by saying, so I was lying in bed last night trying to get to sleep, and you know how you get those intrusive thoughts. And I realized I was talking about sustainable transportation, and I had more slides about how great alleys are than I did about public transportation. So I spent this morning kind of reshuffling everything and adding a few more slides to focus more on transit, which I think is obviously very important. So if I stumble, it's because probably things are not in the same place they were this morning. And not to start on a downer, but I thought if we're going to talk about sustainable transportation, we also have to think about what's unsustainable about our current built environment. And I thought this diagram did a great job of kind of summarizing all of those. This was part of a paper that really looked at all of the true cost of car dependency. And they talked about the noise, obviously the number of deaths per year, which I think in the US is usually about 40,000 people, which can you imagine if we lost that many people with plane crashes, they would probably ground all the planes. But there's all these direct impacts that we have on car dependency, and this does not even get to some of the social impacts and some of the isolation, or the fact that seniors and young people can't get around on their own. So there's a lot of reasons to try to change this, and yet probably 9 out of 10 of us arrive by car because the built environment is so dependent on cars right now. It's really hard to get around without, obviously. But we can transform the environment. It'll just take some time. And there's a word missing off of that. So I wanted to start by kind of framing the discussion about what we call the public realm. This is a good image that represents the public realm, but a lot of the work that we need to do, I think, in the cities is to address the public realm. And if we look at our model of the city up there, just taking a little chunk of the city, you can kind of break up cities into two different distinct parts. And this is kind of like the 101 of urban design and planning. To me, it's one of the most important concepts. So you have on the left what we call the public realm, and on the right the private realm. So the private realm are the houses and the businesses and the buildings. And on the left are the streets and the parks and the public buildings like the libraries. And there's some text, I think, missing on this one as well. So again, on the left, we have the parks and businesses. And what I was going to say on this one is, I think we're really moving in the right direction in kind of transforming the private realm, which you usually do through zoning and regulations. So we've reduced the parking or eliminated the parking requirements. We're opening up more areas to a little bit more density. And all of those things kind of help build a more sustainable future. But when it comes to transforming the public realm, the streets, and adding the bike lanes and the sidewalks, that's much more difficult to do. It's also much more expensive to do, obviously. And Ethan, some text is missing off several of these slides, so hopefully I'll be able, and some images, so hopefully we'll be able to get through it anyway. Not sure what happened. But these images are kind of showing kind of two different ways to invest in the public realm. On the left, it's kind of how we've been doing it for really the past 100 years. We've been investing in wider streets, moving traffic. The images on the left are not from Lexington, they're from another city, but we have similar conditions. And then you have this kind of alternative vision where you can invest in things like living streets and more green space and gardens and things like that. So it's kind of a question of where we want to invest our money.
Go back one slide and then go forward again, and it should fix it.
Oh, you're right. Okay, magic. So now you got the left and the right. You can see the contrast. Okay, I'm going to go back and then, okay. And to kind of focus in on kind of a local example, looking at the Woodland Triangle, which is one of my favorite areas of Lexington, one of the most walkable areas. In fact, I just bought a duplex and we'll be living close to this area. And if you think again about that concept of the public and private realm, so you look at the private realm, the buildings that frame the street are pretty nice. They're older buildings, historic buildings. There's a newer one in the background. but they make a nice setting for the street. But then if we kind of try to zero in on what's happening in the public realm, so again, going back to the quality of the street and the sidewalks, we have the overhead utilities, we've got some kind of cracked sidewalks. And if you kind of married this environment with a, whoops, okay, need your help. Did I touch something?
Sorry, y'all. I simply don't understand. Yeah,
I'm glad you're close by.
yeah. The modern world. Too modern for even me. Where were you on that?
Keep going. Okay. I think I was back. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay.
Hopefully it doesn't do that again.
So anyway, this just kind of highlights some of the deficiencies that we really need to invest a little bit more in the public realm, in our sidewalks, in our streetscapes, maybe in some of these areas we really need to nurture the walkability. I mean, this is a little gem in the middle of our city, but it hasn't seen maybe quite enough love and care over the past few decades. And I know this is an area actually that my grandparents used to shop at because they used to talk about going to the stores here. So, and we need to think about, have a vision a little bit more like this maybe for an area like that, or even this one where they've turned this street into a pedestrian priority street. And so let's talk about transit. And I come at transit from more of a land use and planning side. I'm not a transportation planner. So I'm going to focus more on the physical environment and a little bit less on the operation. But they really have to work together, you know, obviously to make transit work. And this is one of my favorite quotes about transit. This is, I'm a fan of Saturday Night Live. And Michael Che, this was the punchline to a joke. I can't remember the premise of the joke, but I remember him saying, we don't take public transportation because we like to, and he was talking about New Yorkers. We take public transportation because we have to. And he kind of burst my bubbles because I thought all New Yorkers love public transportation because that's why I like to go to New York to take the subway and everything. But I think it does expose some truths that, you know, there's a lot of people that would probably choose to be in the comfort of their own car, even a lot of New Yorkers if they had the choice. But, you know, it begs the question, why do they have to take public transportation? And I think one of the main reasons is there's very little parking in New York City. So they've got the streets and they've got the cars, but, you know, the parking is super expensive if you can find it at all, and there's a little bit of street parking. So there's all these reasons kind of built into this statement. And then I think if you thought about it, if you thought about what you'd have to do to New York City to make it car friendly and less transit friendly, obviously you would have to take down some of the buildings and build surface parking lots and parking garages. So I think you could spend another 15 minutes kind of dissecting that punchline and get a lot of subtle meanings out of it. But we'll move on. But there are a lot of good reasons that we need a robust transit system in our city. Obviously, to provide mobility choices for people that don't own cars, to serve the disabled community, to provide access to jobs and services, to reduce emissions, and to take up less space. One of the things I'm going to focus on later is just cars taking up an incredible amount of space in our cities, not just for movement, but for parking as well. And of course, to create safer environments for our kids and families in our neighborhoods, getting more cars off the road to travel at higher speeds is a good thing, I think. Okay, let's see what's missing. And then this is kind of common sense, but it needs to be emphasized that a functional transit system is dependent on a safe pedestrian environment. So think about it, if you're going to go take the bus, you're probably going to walk a certain distance from your house to the bus stop, right? And if that environment is not safe for pedestrians, you're likely not going to take that trip to the bus, and the same when you get off the bus. And so this type of environment, which you guys might recognize, is not a great environment for transit. This is not really conducive to transit. And this person is running, I think, partly because it's raining, but also a lot of people run across these intersections because they don't want to get run over by a car. And I've also noticed, I mentioned this to Fred the other day, that if you ever see somebody jaywalking across Nicholasville Road when the traffic is really strong, if you look to the other side, there's usually a bus stop over there. So it just kind of exposes this conflict between transit, pedestrian activity, and the vehicular movement. So if we're going to really make transit work, again, we have to deal with the two realms, the public realm and the private realm. And I think we're doing, again, pretty good on the private realm side. We're obviously trying to get a little bit more density in the city. But I think sometimes we focus too much on that, too much on the density aspect. We have to really marry that with improvements to the public realm in the form of the bike lanes, the wider sidewalks, to make all of those connections between the transit and your final destination. And Lexington is not alone. This is a project I was involved with in Fort Worth, and they were looking at a bus rapid transit along the street, which is East Lancaster. And we were dealing with it more from the land use side, but when we looked at this proposed location for a stop, the street network is pretty good. It's got a gridded street network, right, which usually makes pedestrian activity, usually facilitates walking. But if you got down on the ground and looked at where the sidewalks were, these are the only sidewalks that they had within a quarter-mile radius of that bus stop. So a lot of good it's going to do to have this bus rapid transit stop. Just blocks, you know, these folks down on the lower right side have no sidewalks in their neighborhood that are going to lead to this huge investment in this bus rapid transit system. So we showed, you know, all the sidewalks that would need to be built to really facilitate that, and hopefully they're going to do that. Of course, funding all of that is another big challenge. And then it's just a matter of space that cars take up, and probably a lot of you have seen this diagram or a version of this diagram that compares the amount of space that, you know, maybe 70 people traveling in a bus take up in a roadway versus, you know, if they're all on a single car vehicle. So, you know, and then now multiply that by, you know, hundreds of people driving around, and you see how much space is consumed. I'm getting in the hang of this. I got to go backwards and then forward. And it's not just the movement of the cars, but also the parking. So if you're laying out a parking lot, you know that that a parking space with all the aisles and entrances and landscaping and everything is usually about 350 square feet per car. This actually uses a lower number. It says 650 for 2 spaces. So that's equivalent to a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. So every time we have 2 parking spaces in a parking lot or parking garage, you know, we've lost an opportunity for housing. We're putting another housing unit. So that's kind of the sacrifice. That's where a lot of the money is going, that kind of makes housing more expensive, is that we've got to accommodate all the parking. And as Brandy mentioned earlier, we have this kind of geometry problem here in Lexington. This is kind of a diagram showing New Circle Road. And we have our 2 kind of big employment centers in UK and downtown highlighted there. And this would kind of work pretty well for transit, right? Because all of the transit lines are kind of converging, and we have our central station there towards the center. And that kind of works well. But when you kind of diagrammatically think of the space that all of these cars that are coming from the suburbs, and they're all coming along in the arterials, and you know, that's not to scale, but let's say that one of those cars represents 200 cars or 2,000 cars. and they're all trying to converge into this small area around the downtown and UK. So that's why the roadways keep getting wider, and we have to build more parking lots and more parking garages. There they are converging, and then, you know, if we keep building out more and more, we've got even a bigger problem. So I think transit can kind of help solve some of these issues. And then I was going to put in a plug for this book. If you just like a general discussion about transit, it's really opened my eyes to a few things. It's called Human Transit by Jarrett Walker. And I just grabbed a few takeaways from this book I thought were interesting. If you're like me, you may have seen, you know, these big empty buses or nearly empty buses riding around town, and not just Lexington, everywhere, and thought, man, why don't they use smaller buses? But this book points out that the most expensive part of that bus is the driver, right? The salary of the driver and all the maintenance and everything. And it really is more economical to use the larger buses to handle the largest trips of the day. And I have been on the number 5 on Nicholasville Road when it's nearly full. So it does happen. And that's more economical than adding more buses, more small buses, and you have to put a driver in every one. So next time you see a big empty bus go by. And then just the difficult decisions that transit agencies have to make regarding ridership and coverage, right? So if you designed a transit routes to maximize ridership, you might focus just on certain areas that had the highest density, that maybe had the most employment. So maybe Nicholasville Road and Broadway and North Broadway, and you know, you might have very few transit routes, but you would have high ridership because that's where most of the people. However, if you want a more equitable distribution, you might kind of branch out into even some of the lower density areas to give more residents an opportunity to ride the bus, but you might sacrifice ridership. So I think Lexington does a pretty good job of balancing those two things, because usually most cities, they do kind of strike a balance rather than going for one or the other. But it's a constant kind of question on what is your priority, coverage or ridership. And then this is kind of the obvious one for choice riders as opposed to captive riders. Captive riders don't have a choice. They may have to take transit. But for those of us that may have alternative means of transportation, obviously time is the biggest factor. You know, I happen to live about 5 miles from downtown right now, and I commute into town. And you know, I can drive in about 15, 20 minutes, and it's about an hour bus ride, you know, by the time I ride my bike to where the bus stop is and get on the bus and then get off. And I still try to do it once a week, but obviously time is precious. And conversely, if you think about a city like New York, it's going to be faster to take a subway, or you know, in Chicago, probably the same with the L there. So I think we kind of have to aim to bend the curve a little bit more. Maybe if we do some of these complete streets and traffic calming, it might slow down your commute a little bit, but it might speed up your commute by bike or transit or some other means. So beyond complete streets, and I know I'm almost out of time. Yeah?
About a minute and a half.
Okay, a minute and a half. So I'm just going to show a few things. These are, so my initial idea, because I knew that Brandy was talking about complete streets, I started thinking about all the other mobility tools that couldn't be classified as complete streets because they just do kind of one thing, but they do it really well. And they should be considered part of the mobility network. And the first one is kind of the obvious one again. This is just a point that I think a lot of the best opportunity for walkability occurs in the neighborhoods, right? Some of the arterials are going to be hard to transform, but okay, back to sidewalks. So sidewalks are kind of the basic one, but it's not just about the slab of concrete. It's about the quality of the pedestrian environment. As Ethan mentioned, I worked here through the 90s and I left for 20 years. And then I came back, and I'm pretty sure that this stretch of woodland has been paved a couple of times since I left. But that sidewalk looks pretty much the same as when I left 20 years ago. There's a little patch of new concrete where they put in a meter. And there's a bike rack also that they've added, thankfully. But you look at the, the patchwork of the concrete and the curbs, and I'd really like to see more investment in this. It is possible, by the way, to add trees between parking spaces, because parking spaces are kind of valuable for the businesses, but you can actually build islands in between the parking spaces. So there are ways to improve this. Also, at least in this area, putting the utilities underground would be great. Okay, I'm going to skip some of these in the interest of time. Diagram showing some of the best traits of sidewalks. Oh, and again, so Lexington doesn't feel bad. This is a sidewalk in Fort Worth. So again, it's not just Lexington. And then because the description of my talk mentioned Denmark, I better stop on this one because these are the only slides that talk about Denmark. But, but I visited some friends out there last year, and these are his two sons, and they boasted to me that they had been riding their bikes to school by themselves since they were 6 years old. And this is an area that is not dense, it's not urban, it's pretty suburban, but just with a little bit of planning ahead of time, they managed to make it bike and transit friendly. So this shows their path from their house up there on the upper left. And the green is a trail that's completely separated from the vehicular traffic. And then they put the park, the school, the sports complex, and the daycare all clustered together in one area. And then if the kids, or if the parents want to ride with the kids to school, they can drop them off and they keep going on the orange line, and like a half mile down the road is the train station. They can put their bike on the train and go to Copenhagen, to the center of Copenhagen in about 10 minutes. So it was just a little bit of planning ahead of time, and these bike trails are not expensive. That's just a strip of asphalt. We just need to make sure that we, draw the map, put it on the map, require it when developers come in to do a new neighborhood. And I know a lot of that planning is being considered in the expansion areas. We just got to make sure it also gets implemented. And then this is comparing two sections of roadway. The one on the right is a section of Tate's Creek near a couple of schools, and the one on the left is that same area of Denmark. And I think they're about the same right-of-way width if you look, just kind of eyeball them. But I would probably not let my nephew ride a bike on that bike lane to school, whereas the ones on the left where they had the protected bike lanes seem much more manageable. You'll notice that the travel lanes are also much narrower. So they really kind of emphasize the bikeability of it. Okay, I'm really going to shoot through these. These are called paseos. These are basically pedestrian shortcuts that you can put from block to block to connect green spaces. This is a project in Texas. They had some kind of long blocks, so they used these paseos to connect these two green spaces. So you don't always have to build a street. Streets are very expensive, but a little narrow strip of sidewalk between lots can give you better pedestrian connection. And then this one is shared streets and strazas. Straza is a word that I kind of coined because I like the idea of a street and a plaza coming together. It's a gathering space and a way to get from A to B. But this whole movement started with the Wooners in Netherlands and began with living streets. This is kind of the first example of tactical urbanism. When people wanted to slow down traffic in their neighborhoods, they started planting trees and bushes to slow down the cars. And that's turned into a whole movement. This is in Mexico City. This is a shared street in Mexico City. I love this one because it's like the bull in the china shop. It's like the pedestrians are in control in this environment, you can tell. Okay, and then straza is the word I'm using these days because nobody can remember Woonerf. And shared street is just kind of, I thought, boring, so I start calling them strazas. And then I have to talk about alleys because I was pretty excited about this. And I'll probably have 2 minutes. I'm past my time, but But alleys can do some great things for walkability and for neighborhoods. And this one also happens to have my last name, Huston, which is why I put it in there. There's a Huston alley in downtown. And this was my humble alley in the back of my house in Florida. And even though it doesn't look fancy, it's doing a lot of really good things. It's performing in a good way. First of all, it's taking care of the overhead utility lines, so they don't have to be on the front on the street. They can be in the back. It's obviously a place for trash pickup, recycle bins, a way to access your garage and parking. So it's doing a lot of heavy lifting that doesn't have to be done by the front of the street. Also, we talk a lot about missing middle housing. It's really difficult to do that without alleys. It's difficult to park them because you have to have the driveway, you have to have the turning radius. It ends up with the whole backyard is pretty much paved. But if you have alleys, you can just line up parking spaces all along the alley, and it kind of makes everything work. And then this is, again, going back to kind of what the paradigm is now. I know it's changing here, but we used to put the garages on the front, and that obviously created a lot of conflicts with pedestrians. Every time you have a driveway, you're turning a car in front of a sidewalk where there could be a kid on a bike. So if we just use alleys and put the garages in the back, suddenly the pedestrians, have free reign on the sidewalk. You might want to put a front porch out there to give a little more interaction with your neighbors. And in some places, they're even turning those streets into greenways because the vehicles are all accessing from the rear. And I think I have an example. This is a project in Oklahoma that did just that. So this is made possible because there are alleys in the backyard. And another one, you can also cluster houses around green spaces. So this has got a system of alleys behind those houses, and now the kids can come directly out of their house and play in the front yard. And they can become, even quite beautiful things if you really care about or kind of control the architecture. Oops. Oh, I think that was about the end anyway. I think I've said enough about alleys. A lot of the work I'm doing right now is in Texas, and I can tell you that they're trying to do a lot of transit-oriented development. And I do think they have some success stories. They've built some commuter lines, and I'm trying to think of the one community. Usually when I go into DFW, I take the train from the airport to my colleague's house. And so I pass by some of these communities, and I have seen some housing being built up around those stops. I can't give you the names of those, but I know a lot of other cities are just in the planning stages. And one thing that we've been writing form-based codes and zoning for some of those areas, and we're really trying to loosen up the zoning to allow more mixture of uses and not require necessarily vertical mixed use. You hear a lot of talk about vertical mixed use and how it's necessary, but I always point out, if you think about a cross section through Manhattan, if you were to walk down every block, quite a few of those blocks have vertical mixed use. They have stores on the ground floor and housing above, but you'll walk for several blocks where it's just row houses and housing. So we don't need to focus, I think, so much on the commercial aspect of in the transit-oriented development. It needs to be housing-based with enough commercial to serve the people that live there, I would say. I think it's going to happen incrementally. I know, and the director, I don't know where Fred is. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but the director of Lexington is here and could probably take that better. But I think there are a couple of things. One, you can obviously make the operation more efficient. For example, when you're talking about bus rapid transit, You do things like you prepay for your boarding so that you don't have that delay when you get on the bus of people putting in their dollar. I mean, right now, you know, it's pretty much you have to pay once you get on the bus. So doing little things like that to increase efficiency, also having dedicated bike or bus lanes, which is again kind of difficult to do in our environment. All these things sound good, but when you start telling people that you're going to take a lane or two away from some arterial that they use to get into town, you know, people sometimes change their minds. So I think that, and then yeah, matching that with development that's clustered around the bus stops, so that you can go from kind of one center to another and start to connect all of these kind of more dense neighborhoods. And again, going back to the lane issue, I mean, I think that's what makes transit more desirable, is maybe it's going to take a little bit longer to make the commute by car, and suddenly transit, you know, that gap, that delta in the time starts to decrease a little bit, so that could help. Yeah, I think really all of those things, and again, I want to emphasize that it's not just about the density, it's also about the infrastructure. I mean, if you don't have a sidewalk going to a bus stop, which we have, you know, we have conditions like that where we've got bus stops on Tate's Creek that don't have any sidewalk at all along there. So maybe the first thing is, let's start improving the infrastructure, the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, to get you to those bus stops. And then when you start adding in, you know, this kind of incremental density, and it doesn't have to be high rise, it can be, you know, most large cities have a lot of 2- and 3-story building stock, and it supports transit. I was just in Toronto not long ago, and there's like 2-story buildings everywhere, and there's also streetcars everywhere. So it doesn't have to be high rise to get the density that you need. And yeah, traffic becoming unbearable, you know, that'll help. Transit, you know, our roadways cannot really cram more lanes into the right-of-ways as, you know, that we have right now. So I do think that, you know, traffic is going to slow down a little bit, and maybe that's okay. Or you could do like New York City and take away all the parking, and then you have no choice but to ride transit. So. So, not my area of expertise, but I mean, it's not going to solve the mobility issues that we have in the city if it's autonomous. They still are going to take up traffic lanes. There's still going to be conflicts with pedestrians. It could have a positive impact in reducing the parking needs. If more people are using kind of a form of shared transportation, maybe they don't need to own their car, so that's one less car you have to park somewhere. So if it keeps, you know, kind of the circulation pattern moving, that might be one positive benefit. But I don't see it as the panacea that it's going to solve all of our mobility problems. I do think there's some potential in transit and some circulators and things like that. I've ridden on a couple where there was a little autonomous shuttle that took you from the like where the grocery store was to out to the houses and things like that. So I think that could work pretty well. You know, I would go back to areas like the Woodland Triangle or the Gray Line Station. I would like to see us nurture some of those areas that are already there and kind of turn those into the real bike and pedestrian gyms that they could be. Even like Romney Road, Chevy Chase, all of those places are pretty walkable, but could be like so much better. And I think that would be good for residents that to live there, but also for tourism, for the economy. So obviously, you know, a transit-oriented development you can't really do a quick build of that, but anything we can do within what we have already, I think would be the way to go. Nurture what we have.